At 12:23 in the early morning of August 31st, 1997, driver Henry Paul lost control of the black Mercedes at the entrance to the Pont de l'Alma-Tunnel, and the car crashed at more than 60 miles per hour into the 13th concrete pillar supporting the vault. Dodi Fayed died on impact. Henry Paul died on impact. Trevor Rees-Jones, the bodyguard in the front passenger seat and the only one of the four wearing a seatbelt, survived with serious injuries including facial fractures and loss of memory of the minutes before the crash. Diana Spencer, 36 years old, Princess of Wales, former wife of the heir to the British throne and mother of the two princes who would inherit that crown, was found conscious but in critical condition between the two rear seats, trapped with one foot caught under the front seat. Emergency teams took 40 minutes to extract her from the vehicle. She was transferred to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital in Paris. At 4:15 in the morning, Professor Bruno Rieu, head of the resuscitation team, came out to announce that the princess had died of an internal thoracic hemorrhage. In the hours that followed, 3 billion people around the world received the news. The world that knew that name, and virtually the entire world knew that name, stopped. But that is the story of the ending. The story that no one has told in full. The one with more layers and more questions than the headlines allow, begins much earlier. It begins in the summer of 1996, when Diana Spencer received the settlement from her divorce from Prince Charles and found herself alone with £17 million, her apartments in Kensington Palace, the title of Princess of Wales without the title of Royal Highness, and the question that no one had yet been able to answer for her. What was going to become of her? To understand what happened in the Alma-Tunnel, you first have to understand who the two people in the back seat of that Mercedes were. And to understand that, you have to understand the years that had brought them to that point. Because those years are exactly the ones, the official version, the one about an accident caused by a drunk driver chased by paparazzi, does not require you to explain. The marriage of Diana and Charles had become, in the 90s, the symbol of everything that can go wrong when two people are pushed into marriage for reasons that have more to do with the needs of an institution than with the compatibility of two human beings. Diana was 20 years old when she got engaged. Charles was 32. She did not know his prior history with Camilla when she accepted the proposal, or she knew it vaguely but didn't understand what it meant. The night before the wedding, according to later testimonies from people who were with her, Diana cried without stopping in her rooms at Clarence House. What followed the wedding was a spiral documented in the book Diana, her true story by writer Andrew Morton, published in 1992, which contained the account Diana herself had provided on secretly recorded audio cassettes. Diana denied at the time having cooperated with the book. Years later, it became clear she had been the primary source. The book described suicide attempts, bulimia, a sense of complete entrapment within an institution that was not equipped to help someone with her emotional needs. It was the portrait of a woman who had felt completely alone at the center of the most watched system on the planet. The separation was announced on December 9, 1992, by Prime Minister John Major in the House of Commons. Diana's interview on the BBC's Panorama program in November 1995, in which she described her bulimia, her self-harm attempts, and the 3 that were in her marriage, was watched by 200 million people worldwide and was the factor that accelerated the final divorce. The Queen personally wrote in December 1995 telling them it was time. Diana Frances Spencer was born on July 1, 1961, at Park House on the Sandringham Estate in Norfolk. She was the third of 4 children of Viscount Althorp, later Earl Spencer, and his first wife, Frances Burke Roche. Diana's childhood was marked by her parents' divorce in 1969, when she was 8 years old, and by the bitter custody battle that followed. Her mother left with her new lover and then husband. Her father kept the children. The trauma of that abandonment, of an 8-year-old girl who woke one day and her mother was gone and never came back the way mothers in stories come back, is the origin of many of the contradictions that would define Diana's adult life. The compulsive need for emotional connection, the difficulty with trust, the alternation between isolation and desperate searching for affection. What the world saw was the fairy tale. Lady Diana Spencer, 20 years old, blonde, shy, working as a nursery school assistant, wearing the ivory-laced dress with its 25-foot train in St. Paul's Cathedral on July 29, 1981. The most watched wedding in television history to that point. 750 million people worldwide. The prince and the girl from the village. Aristocracy joined with innocence. The fairy tale the 20th century needed. What was not seen, what could not be seen from outside in 1981, is that the relationship between Diana and Prince Charles had structural problems from the beginning. Charles was 13 years older than Diana. He had been in love for years with Camilla Parker Bowles, a married woman whom the royal family would never have approved as consort to the heir to the throne. Diana was young, in love with the idea of being in love, and did not have the emotional resources to understand what she was getting into. Years later, in the most explosive interview of her life, the one she gave to the BBC in November 1995, watched by 200 million people worldwide, Diana described it this way. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. The 3 were Charles, Diana, and Camilla. The phrase Diana used, "There were 3 of us in this marriage," became one of the most quoted lines in the history of the modern British monarchy, and the interview in which she said it, on the BBC's Panorama, was the definitive blow that precipitated the divorce. Queen Elizabeth II personally wrote to Charles and Diana in December 1995, telling them it would be best to divorce as soon as possible. The divorce took effect on August 28, 1996. Diana received £17 million in cash, shared custody of Princes William and Harry, Kensington Palace as her residence, and retained the title of Princess of Wales, though no longer Her Royal Highness. What she did not receive was what she most needed, a clear place in the world. The years between the official separation in 1992 and the death in 1997 are the years in which Diana constructed, almost entirely alone and often against, the active opposition of the institution that had produced her, the most powerful public identity any member of the British royal family had possessed in the 20th century. She didn't build it with the glamour of dresses, though the dresses were part of the arsenal. She built it with physical contact, with the images of her holding the hand of an AIDS patient at a time when AIDS was still a disease no one wanted to literally touch, with the images of her walking barefoot through a minefield in Angola in January 1997, in jeans and a blue protective helmet, while the British Ministry of Defense accused her of meddling in politics. With the images of her in Sarajevo in August 1997, 10 days before her death, speaking with landmine survivors in Bosnia. The campaign against anti-personnel mines was Diana's last great cause and the one that left the most tangible legacy. In December 1997, 3 months after her death, 122 countries signed in Ottawa the international treaty banning the use of anti-personnel mines. The British Foreign Secretary Robin Cook said so in Parliament when he introduced the second reading of the Landmines Bill, paying tribute to Diana's work. The woman who had been accused of meddling in politics had achieved exactly what she was trying to achieve. But that was the public Diana. The private Diana, in the months before her death, was in a state far more complex and far more fragile than the world could see. In 1995, Diana had met Hasnat Khan, a Pakistani-British cardiac surgeon working at the Royal Brompton Hospital in London. The story began when Diana visited a sick friend in the hospital and crossed paths with the doctor treating him. Hasnat Khan was the exact opposite of everything that had surrounded Diana up to that point. Private, discreet, completely outside the world of royalty and celebrity, with no interest in media attention and an active hostility to the public spotlight. Diana called him Mr. Wonderful. Her closest friends, including Tina Brown in her biography The Diana Chronicles, described him after Diana's death as the love of her life. The relationship was extraordinarily secretive for the most photographed woman on the planet. Hasnat Khan hid in the trunk of Diana's butler's car to visit Kensington Palace without being detected by photographers. Diana traveled to Lahore in May 1996 to secretly meet Hasnat's family. She had seriously considered converting to Islam to make a marriage more acceptable to his family. The relationship lasted almost 2 years, and it ended in the summer of 1997, just before the vacation with the Al Fayeds. There are contradictory accounts of who ended the relationship. Hasnat Khan testified at the inquest that it was Diana who told him everything was over at a meeting in Battersea Park in late July 1997. What Khan recounted about that meeting is revealing: that Diana was not her usual self, that she kept looking at her mobile phone, that something had changed. According to the chronology, by that point Diana had already been with the Al Fayeds in Saint-Tropez, and something with Dodi had already begun to develop. The hypothesis some biographers have maintained is that Diana used the beginning of her relationship with Dodi to force a reaction from Hasnat, to compel him to choose, and that when Hasnat did not choose in the direction she hoped, the relationship ended. Tina Brown wrote that the romance with Dodi and the brief one with businessman Gulu Lalvani that summer were a maneuver to provoke a reaction from the true object of her affections, Hasnat Khan. Whatever the exact mechanics, Diana arrived at the summer of 1997 with a broken heart, without the Royal Highness title, with an ambiguous institutional position, without the royal family structure that would have sustained her, even as it suffocated her, and with the question of what she was going to do with the rest of her life completely open. That was the emotional state of the woman who accepted Mohamed Al Fayed's invitation to spend the vacation with his family in Saint-Tropez. Mohamed Al Fayed was in 1997 the most visible symbol of what money can and cannot buy in British society. He was the owner of Harrods, the most famous department store in the world, which he had acquired in 1985 after a ferocious takeover battle with businessman Roland Tiny Roland. He was the owner of the Paris Ritz, bought in 1979. He was the owner of Fulham Football Club. He had a fortune estimated at £1.7 billion sterling, and never, in decades of residence in the United Kingdom and attempts at integration into the British elite, had he managed to get the establishment to accept him as one of their own. The Department of Trade and Industry had published a report in 1990 concluding that Al Fayed and his brother had lied about their origins, their wealth, and their commercial interests when they acquired Harrods. Al Fayed never obtained British citizenship. He was never invited to the kinds of events that signal definitive acceptance in the circles he most wanted to inhabit. And he never stopped trying. The relationship with Diana was, for Al Fayed, far more than a friendship with a popular figure. It was the possibility that his family name would be forever associated with the most famous name in the British monarchy. It was the validation that decades of money and business success had not been able to provide. Dodi Fayed, Mohammed's eldest son by his ex-wife Samira Khashoggi, niece of arms dealer Adnan Khashoggi, was born in Alexandria on April 15, 1955. He grew up between Cairo and Alexandria before being sent to La Rosie boarding school in Switzerland, the most expensive school in the world, where he studied alongside the children of the wealthiest families on the planet. He briefly attended the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst in the UK before devoting himself to the life his father financed with a monthly allowance of £400,000. approximately $600,000 per month in current values. Dodi was known in the circles he moved in as a charming, generous man, completely dependent on his father's money. A photographer who knew him well, and whose testimony was reported by journalist Andrew Neil in the Daily Mail, recalled having warned anyone who would listen. Never get in the back seat of a car with Dodi. He does nothing but shout at the driver to go faster. It's terrifying. Dodi was known for an obsession with evading paparazzi in ways that the security professionals working for his father considered reckless. As a film producer, Dodi had co-produced Chariots of Fire in 1981, the film that won the Academy Award for Best Picture. In the film world, that gave him a genuine credential, even if his role in the production owed more to his father's money than to his own creative contribution. He produced several more films. Through the 80s and 90s, none of the stature of Chariots of Fire. He was executive producer on Hook in 1992, Spielberg's film that brought William and Harry to a London premiere, where they briefly met Diana in the cinema lobby. It was that screening that Dodi recalled years later as the moment he had admired Diana from a distance without knowing her. Dodi was also known for his relationships. His biographers document a list of women he was linked to over the years that includes Brooke Shields, Julia Roberts, Winona Ryder, Daryl Hannah, and Tina Sinatra. He was lavish with gifts, Bulgari jewelry, private jets, trips to Gstaad and Saint-Tropez. He was the kind of man who, when he was interested in someone, demonstrated it at the scale his family fortune allowed. In the summer of 1997, when Diana arrived at the Al Fayed villa in Saint-Tropez with William and Harry, Dodi had a girlfriend. Kelly Fisher was an American model with whom Dodi had been in a relationship for months, one he had presented as serious. Fisher later stated that Dodi had promised her marriage for August 9, 1997, and had given her an engagement ring. When Diana appeared at the Saint-Tropez villa, Dodi was technically engaged to Kelly Fisher. Fisher was assigned to one of the smaller boats in the Al Fayed fleet, while Diana and the princes enjoyed the Jonikal, the 60-meter yacht Mohamed had bought specifically for that season. Diana and her sons arrived in Saint-Tropez in July 1997. William was 15. Harry was 12. Harry recalled it in his memoir, Spare, with the words of someone holding on to a happy memory without knowing it is the last one. The weather was sublime. The food was delicious. Mum was smiling. There was a lot of laughter and teasing, the normalcy of being together. Mum, Willie, and me, though more so on that trip than any other. That was the summer Harry remembered, the one he had before knowing it would be the last. Mohamed Al Fayed had summoned Dodi from Paris to help entertain Diana and her sons. The July photographs at Saint-Tropez show Diana in a swimsuit playing with her children on jet skis, surrounded by the vessel, the security, and the luxuries the Al Fayeds could provide. The paparazzi who arrived at the location, by boat and by helicopter, captured images of a princess who, for the first time in years, seemed to be having a genuinely good time, and they captured the first images of Diana and Dodi together. After William and Harry left for Balmoral with Charles and the rest of the royal family, Diana returned to the Riviera, this time without her children, this time with only Dodi. On August 10, 1997, the Sunday Mirror ran front-page photographs that paparazzi Mario Brenna had taken of the Jonikal while Diana and Dodi kissed on deck. The headline was simply, "The Kiss." The photographs were sold for sums the newspaper never publicly disclosed, though industry sources estimated them as record figures for images of that kind. On August 15th, Kelly Fisher called a press conference in Beverly Hills to announce she was suing Dodi for breach of contract, alleging he had promised her marriage and then abandoned her for Diana. Dodi, through his representatives, denied having been engaged to Fisher. Fisher withdrew the lawsuit weeks later, when circumstances rendered it irrelevant in the worst possible way. What was extraordinary about Diana's humanitarian work was that it was not ceremonial. It was not the kind of hospital visit royal family members made. Shaking hands, opening a ward, posing for the official photograph, and leaving. Diana sat down beside the sick. She touched them. In 1987, when AIDS was still a disease loaded with the stigma of being the punishment of sinners and the promiscuous, Diana shook the ungloved hand of a hospitalized patient. The image went around the world. No member of the royal family had done anything like it. No public figure of that stature had done anything like it. The image said more about the correct attitude toward AIDS patients than any public health campaign any government could have designed. The campaign against anti-personnel mines that occupied the final months of her life had the same logic, making visible with the body what reports and statistics could not make visible. In January 1997, Diana traveled to Angola with a BBC television crew. She walked through a demined field, still dangerous, in jeans, boots, and a blue protective helmet alongside the Halo Trust personnel. The images were broadcast on every news program in the world. The British Ministry of Defence called her an irresponsible person who was meddling in politics. The Conservative government was opposed to the mine ban treaty, and Diana's public position embarrassed it. Diana did not back down. She visited minefields in Bosnia on August 7, 1997, 10 days before her death. She spoke with survivors who had lost limbs. She listened to stories the cameras could not fully capture, because there are things that need to be heard, not photographed. That was the Diana of 1997. Not the princess in the lace dress of 1981. A 36-year-old woman who had learned to use the most powerful asset she possessed, the global attention her presence generated, for causes that without her would not have had that worldwide resonance, and who was still searching for what to do with the rest of that asset, what to do with herself, who she wanted to be in the second half of a life she was beginning for the first time, to see as something she might be able to define herself. Diana spent part of August with her friend Rosa Monckton in Greece, then returned to the Mediterranean with Dodi. On August 24, 1997, a photographer captured the image that would become one of the most iconic and most melancholy photographs in the history of the 20th century. Diana sitting alone on the diving board of the Jonikal, facing the Mediterranean, feet dangling over the water, arm resting on her knee. The image was taken off Portofino. She was not looking at the camera. She was not posing. The photograph that looks like a farewell, those who analyzed it with the weight of knowing what was coming would later write. The image of someone sitting looking out at the sea and thinking about things that do not belong to the world of the Jonikal or to the happiness her face sometimes showed. During that week, Diana and Dodi visited Monaco and entered the Repassi boutique on the Place du Casino. It later emerged, or was attempted to be established, what exactly had happened in that jewelry store. Dodi's father, Mohamed Al Fayed, would later claim that Dodi had purchased a ring at that shop and intended to propose to Diana in Paris that very night. Alberto Repassi, the jeweler, offered contradictory versions over the years. In 2003, he said Diana had tried on the ring on an earlier visit and they had sent it to be adjusted to collect in Paris. He later admitted to a writer that he had received legal papers from Al Fayed, a client of his for more than 20 years. The closed-circuit footage from the Repassi store in Paris showed that on August 30th, the afternoon before the accident, Dodi left the store alone with only a catalogue. The ring that Mohamed Al Fayed displayed for years in the Harrods Memorial as the ring with which his son was going to propose to Diana was purchased by Mohamed Al Fayed after both of their deaths. The British investigators who studied the case for years reached a conclusion informally supported by people who knew Diana well. that Diana had no intention whatsoever of marrying Dodi Fayed, that the relationship was a summer, a distraction, the result of a heart broken by Hasnat Khan searching for something to fill the space. Diana's older sister, Lady Sarah McCorquodale, testified at the inquest that in a telephone conversation on August 29th, the day before the accident, Diana spoke of Dodi in a way that gave her the impression the relationship was on unstable ground. Richard Kay, the Daily Mail journalist who was one of Diana's closest confidants and who received a call from her on the evening of August 30th, the last evening of her life, stated that during that conversation, Diana made no reference to any engagement, any announcement, any plan for a future with Dodi. Diana's private secretary believed that Diana would not have seen Dodi again once they returned to London. Those assessments prove nothing about what Diana genuinely felt for Dodi. They only prove that the narrative Mohamed Al Fayed constructed after his son's death, of a great love that was about to be crowned by an official engagement, was not supported by the available evidence. What the afternoon of August 30th, 1997 did produce was a sequence of decisions that investigators and security analysts have studied for decades, because each one individually was understandable, and the combination of all of them was fatal. Diana and Dodi arrived by private jet at Le Bourget Airport in Paris at 3:30 in the afternoon of August 30th, coming from Sardinia, where they had spent the final days of the Mediterranean trip. Dozens of photographers were waiting. The original plan was to spend the night at Dodi's apartment at 1 Rue Arsène Housset in the 8th arrondissement, near the Champs-Élysées. The apartment was 5 minutes from the Ritz Hotel, owned by Mohamed Al Fayed. The first attempt to reach Dodi's apartment, in a vehicle driven by a security chauffeur, was spotted by the photographers who had followed them from the airport. They returned to the Ritz. They stopped at the Villa Windsor, the former residence of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, also owned by Mohamed Al Fayed, which Diana had visited before. At the Ritz, they were assigned the Imperial Suite, the most luxurious in the hotel. They tried to go out for dinner at the restaurant Chez Benoit, a Michelin-starred bistro. The presence of the photographers made dining there impossible. They returned to the Ritz and dined in the hotel's restaurant around 10 in the evening. The pressure from the paparazzi outside the hotel did not let up. Henri Paul was the deputy head of security at the Ritz. He had finished his shift that afternoon and was off duty. He was called back to the hotel during the night. Bodyguards Rhys Jones and Kieran Wingfield, both employed by the Al Fayeds, saw him drinking at the hotel bar. 2 bartenders, the register records, and the bodyguards themselves confirmed that Paul consumed alcohol that night before getting behind the wheel. The exact amount was one of the most debated points of the inquest. Paul consumed pastis, the anise liqueur that was his preferred drink. An expert cited in the Operation Paget report, the British investigation, estimated that Paul had drunk the equivalent of 10 small glasses of pastis before driving. Paul was also a man with problems. His doctor had testified at the inquest that in the 2 years before his death, Paul had gone through depressive episodes related to the end of a long relationship, and that he sometimes drank alone outside of social contexts. The doctor had prescribed him Prozac in June 1996 and Aotal, an anti-alcohol medication. Paul was taking those medications at the time of his death. The post-mortem toxicological tests found in his blood traces of Prozac, noctamide, a sleeping pill, tiopride, a neuroleptic used against alcoholism, and Aotal. None of those medications is compatible with driving. The combination of all of them with alcohol is especially dangerous. Blood alcohol tests established Paul's level at between 1.73 and 1.75 grams per liter. The legal limit in France was 0.5 grams per liter. Paul was more than 3 times over the French legal limit when he sat down at the wheel of the Mercedes. There is an element of the night of August 30th that a Time magazine investigation, published in 1998, flagged as a detail no one has satisfactorily explained. Henri Paul had, at the time of his death, bank accounts totaling approximately 1 million francs, the equivalent of around 150,000 euros today. It was a considerable sum for someone of his position and salary, and he was carrying more than 1,900 francs in cash that night. The French investigation found that Paul received payments from sources that were never fully identified. Some investigators suggested Paul may have been an informant for French intelligence services, the DGSE, or for other agencies, including MI6. The investigation established no direct connection between those payments and what occurred that night. But the mystery of Paul's money is one of the elements that the conspiracy theories surrounding the accident have exploited for decades. The difference between Dodi and the men who had been in Diana's life before that summer was not money or status. Diana had lived surrounded by money for 16 years. The difference was that Dodi made her laugh, that he took her wherever she wanted by private jet, surrounded her with flowers and gifts and attention, without the complications that real love, the kind with Hasnat Khan, who had to hide in a car trunk to visit her, brought with it. Diana told her closest media friend, Richard Kay, that Dodi was completely different from any man she had ever known, that he was sweet, that he was affectionate, that he made her feel good. What Dodi was to his father was something different. He was the possibility of what Mohamed Al Fayed had been seeking for decades, definitive acceptance in the highest reaches of British society. Al Fayed had bought Harrods, had bought the Ritz, had bought Fulham, had bought the Villa Windsor, the former Paris residence of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. He had given money to conservative politicians in the cash for questions scandal that cost several MPs their seats. And none of those things had given him what he wanted. His son marrying Diana Spencer, mother of the two future kings of England, would have been the pinnacle. That was what Al Fayed wanted to happen. Whether it was what Dodi wanted, whether it was what Diana wanted, is a question that the people who knew them well answered in completely different ways. The decision to leave by the rear exit of the Ritz was Dodi's. Trevor Rees-Jones stated in the French investigation that Dodi took an active role in the security decisions and that he was the one in charge that night. The plan was for the official car to leave through the main entrance on the Place Vendôme, at the front of the hotel, to attract the attention of the photographers waiting there, while a second car, the Mercedes with Diana, Dodi, Rees-Jones, and Henri Paul, slipped out discreetly through the rear exit on the Rue Cambon. The Ritz security staff initially resisted executing the plan without Mohamed Al Fayed's authorization. Dodi called his father. Mohamed had reservations and told Dodi simply to relax with Diana at the Ritz. Dodi insisted. Mohamed gave in. Years later, when journalist Andrew Neil visited Mohamed after the accident, Dodi's father told him what he had felt in that moment, a tear in his eye. "I will never forgive myself for agreeing to Dodi's plan. He would still be alive if I hadn't allowed it." At 12:10 in the early morning of August 31st, 1997, the black Mercedes left through the rear door of the Ritz onto the Rue Cambon. On board were Diana, Dodi, Trevor Rees-Jones, and Henri Paul. None of the passengers were wearing seatbelts. Only Rees-Jones had his on. The decision not to wear seatbelts, in a car traveling at high speed through the streets of Paris to escape photographers on motorbikes, is the element of that night about which the investigations were most unequivocal. Diana's and Dodi's lives would have been saved had they been wearing seatbelts, Paris prosecutor's office concluded. The survivor of that night was the only one who was. The photographers waiting on the Rue Cambon spotted the car. The chase began. The Mercedes accelerated. It took the Rue de Rivoli, crossed the Place de la Concorde, and rather than taking the Champs-Élysées, turned toward the Voie Georges Pompidou, the express road running along the Seine. By that point, the car was traveling at a speed far above the permitted limit, and the photographers on motorbikes were following. At 12:23, the Mercedes entered the Pont de l'Alma-Tunnel. Testimonies differ on whether the photographers were inside or outside the tunnel, behind or in front. What does not differ is the speed. The vehicle entered the tunnel at between 73 and 96 miles per hour, in a zone with a 31 mile per hour limit. Inside the tunnel, the Mercedes grazed a white Fiat Uno traveling in the right lane. The Fiat was never conclusively identified, though the French investigation maintained it was probably the vehicle of a man named Levantin, who was questioned and cleared as a suspect, but whose acquaintances noted inconsistencies in his account. Tan subsequently refused all requests for interviews. The Mercedes, destabilized by the contact with the Fiat, veered left and struck head-on the 13th concrete pillar of the tunnel. The car spun, struck the stone wall in the opposite direction, and came to rest. The horn sounded without interruption for a long time, pressed by the inert body of the driver. The first photographers reached the car seconds later. The images they took through the windows of the destroyed vehicle, with its occupants inside, were purchased by several European publications before the authorities arrived. 3 of those photographers were convicted years later of invasion of privacy and fined €1 symbolic each. The 9 photographers who had participated in the chase were investigated for involuntary manslaughter and failure to assist persons in danger. The charges were dropped in 2002. The French investigation concluded in 1999 that the accident was caused by the reckless driving of Henri Paul, under the influence of alcohol and drugs, who drove the vehicle at excessive speed, and that the paparazzi chase contributed to creating the circumstances of the accident. Paul was declared the sole party responsible. The British inquest jury, presided over by Lord Justice Baker, ruled in 2008 that Diana and Dodi had been the victims of grossly negligent manslaughter, resulting from the reckless driving of Henri Paul and the drivers of the vehicles pursuing them. And then there was Mohamed Al Fayed's theory. From February 1998, 6 months after his son's death, Mohamed Al Fayed publicly maintained that Diana and Dodi had not died in an accident but had been assassinated by British intelligence agents under orders from Prince Philip, the husband of Queen Elizabeth II. The motive, according to Al Fayed, was to prevent Diana, mother of the future King of England, from marrying an Egyptian Muslim and potentially giving birth to a half-sibling of William and Harry with Arab blood. Al Fayed further claimed that Diana was pregnant with Dodi's child at the time of her death. The theory required explaining several things that Al Fayed explained in ways independent investigators found unsustainable. Diana's pregnancy was never confirmed by any medical evidence. The post-mortem examination found no evidence of pregnancy. Al Fayed responded that the evidence had been manipulated. On the engagement, the closed-circuit footage showed Dodi leaving the Riposi store with only a catalog on the afternoon of August 30th. Al Fayed responded that the ring was already in Paris waiting to be collected after being adjusted. In 2008, Al Fayed testified at the British inquest that among the conspirators were Prince Philip, Prince Charles, 2 former Metropolitan Police commissioners, and the CIA. The investigator John McNamara, a former Scotland Yard detective who had worked for Al Fayed for 5 years investigating the case, testified at the inquest that after 5 years of investigation, he had found no evidence of a criminal conspiracy to kill the princess, nor that she was engaged or pregnant at the time of her death, beyond what Al Fayed himself had told him. The French and British investigations reached the same conclusions independently. There was no evidence of a conspiracy. The accident was caused by the reckless driving of a drunk driver who drove at excessive speed through a tunnel whose conditions could not sustain that speed while attempting to escape photographers. The absence of seatbelts on the rear passengers was determinative for the fatal outcome. but there are elements that the official investigations did not explain in a completely satisfactory manner, and that have fed decades of doubt. The mystery of Henri Paul's money. The accounts totaling 1 million francs with no identified source was never resolved. The white Fiat Uno was never conclusively identified. The abnormally high level of carbon monoxide in Paul's blood, flagged by Time magazine in 1998, was attributed to his smoking and the urban environment he lived in, but some forensic experts found it unusually elevated. The Mercedes used that night was a vehicle that had been stolen and repaired after a prior accident, and several automotive experts noted that the repair may have left mechanical problems, particularly in wheel alignment, that would have contributed to the vehicle's instability at high speed. And Mohamed Al Fayed's armored Mercedes was available that night, equipped with sophisticated safety systems used by Dodi on other occasions, and no satisfactory explanation was ever given for why that car was not used. The note Diana supposedly wrote years before her death, published by her butler Paul Burrell in 2003, added another layer to the story. In that note, according to Burrell, Diana had written that Charles was planning an accident for her, brake failure and serious head injury, so that he could remarry. The note was later connected to the smear campaign journalist Martin Bashir had conducted to obtain the 1995 BBC interview, a campaign that included false documents and fabricated accusations. The authenticity of the note, its context, and its true significance were disputed in ways that make it impossible to use as evidence of anything specific. There is a moment from that summer of 1997 that time has turned into something more than an anecdote. Diana was in Milan in early July to attend the funeral of Gianni Versace, the designer who had been shot and killed outside his Miami Beach home on July 15, 1997, by serial killer Andrew Cunanan. Versace was one of her closest friends. The funeral was one of Diana's first major public appearances after months spent in relative privacy, recovering from the end of the relationship with Hasnat, preparing the next chapter of her life. The images of Diana at Versace's funeral in Milan Cathedral, dressed in black, composed, present, are among the last formal images of her in a context outside the Mediterranean. 46 days later, Diana was dead. The speed with which everything unfolded that summer has a quality that biographers have noted repeatedly. That of something that developed too quickly for anyone around her to process it in real time. Diana and Dodi met on July 14, 1997. 47 days later, they had died together. Of those 47 days, the British investigation established that they had been together for approximately 23. That is all. 23 days together in total before the world turned them into the symbol of a truncated love, whose magnitude no one could establish with certainty, because they had not had time to discover it themselves. The world Diana inhabited at that moment had a particularity that makes it impossible to understand what happened without keeping it in mind. Diana in 1997 generated the highest level of media attention of any private, or semi-public, individual in the history of celebrity journalism to that point. A photograph of Diana in any context was worth tens of thousands of pounds. A photograph of Diana with a man with whom she clearly had some kind of relationship was worth hundreds of thousands. The photographs of Diana kissing Dodi on the Jonikal that paparazzi Mario Brenna sold to the Sunday Mirror in August 1997 were sold for prices the newspaper never fully disclosed, but which industry sources estimated in the range of £1 million sterling. In that market, chasing Diana's car through the streets of Paris at midnight was not madness. It was the rational pursuit of a product worth amounts of money that justified virtually any level of risk. That is not an excuse. It is a description of the system that produced the night of August 31st, 1997. a system in which the market value of a photograph of Diana was high enough that people on motorcycles would chase a car at illegal speeds through the streets of a city at midnight. A system that Diana herself had fed for years, using the press when it suited her and hating it when it did not. A system that never had rules protecting the people who generated the product from the mechanisms that exploited that product. What the accident of August 31st, 1997, left behind was a wound that time never fully closed. For the people who knew and loved Diana, the question of whether she might have been saved if she had been transferred more quickly to a hospital in Nice, better equipped than the one in Paris, rather than treated for 45 minutes at the accident scene while doctors tried to stabilize her, is a question the inquest doctors tried to answer. But their answers did not convince everyone. The French medical protocol of the era for serious trauma included stabilization at the accident scene before transfer. Diana's injury, a rupture of the pulmonary vein causing the hemorrhage that killed her, was an injury requiring immediate surgery. The time she spent at the accident scene before being transferred was time that, in the opinion of some trauma specialists not directly involved in the case, might have made a difference. That question has no definitive answer either. The doctors who attended her that night followed established protocols. The protocols were correct for the condition Diana was in when they arrived. The outcome was what it was. Diana's funeral was held on September 6, 1997, at Westminster Abbey. 3 million people lined the streets of London to watch the coffin pass. 18 million flowers were deposited at the gates of Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace. 2,500 people attended the funeral. Elton John sang a rewritten version of Candle in the Wind, dedicated to Diana, that became the best-selling single in music history, 33 million copies. Diana's brother, Earl Spencer, delivered a tribute that included a veiled accusation against the media and the royal family that all those with blood on their hands should reflect. Dodi was buried on the day of the accident itself, August 31st, 1997, at Brookwood Cemetery in Surrey, in accordance with Islamic tradition. His remains were later transferred to the Fayed estate. Mohamed Al Fayed erected 2 memorials in Harrods. The first, unveiled in 1998, was a kitsch pyramid with photographs of Diana and Dodi, a wine glass from their last dinner, and a ring Al Fayed claimed was the ring with which Dodi was going to propose. The second, unveiled in 2005, was a bronze statue of the 2 of them releasing an albatross, titled Innocent Victims. When Harrods was sold to the Qatari royal family in 2010 for £1.5 billion sterling, the memorials were removed from the store at the request of the new owners. Mohamed Al Fayed died on August 30th, 2023, one day before the anniversary of his son's death, at 94 years old. He was buried at Brookwood Cemetery alongside Dodi. In the years following his death, multiple women who had worked for him or had come into contact with him filed assault allegations that painted a completely different portrait of the man who had spent decades constructing his image as a grief-stricken father and defender of truth. Al Fayed did not live to answer those accusations. The story of Diana and Dodi is, at its most visible level, the story of 2 people who died in circumstances that a series of bad decisions, stacked one upon another, made inevitable. A driver who should not have driven. An evasion plan that no professional with real security experience would have approved. Passengers without seatbelts. A speed that doubled the limit in an urban nighttime zone. The story is one of accidents that happen when the people responsible for safety prioritize other things. But it is also the story of something harder to name. The story of a woman who had spent 16 years being the most photographed person on the planet, who had learned to use that attention for causes that would otherwise not have had that global impact, and who nevertheless never found a way to live with that attention that was not destructive. the story of someone who, in the summer of 1997, was trying, in ways that were not all correct, to find who she was when no one was watching, and who died being chased by the same lenses that had made her famous. The flame of liberty. The golden replica of the torch of the Statue of Liberty that stands on the roundabout above the Alma-Tunnel in Paris became on September 1st, 1997, a spontaneous memorial. People left flowers, letters, photographs. Still today, 27 years later, flowers continue to appear at the base of that flame. Not because the location has anything to do with Diana, who lies buried at the lake of the Althorpe family estate, but because it is the place closest to where what happened, and there are people who still need somewhere to go to say something to someone who left too soon. The reaction of the British royal family to Diana's death is itself a chapter that deserves space, because it was one of the most significant institutional mistakes of the monarchy in the 20th century. Queen Elizabeth II did not appear in public for days. The family was at Balmoral with William and Harry, and the official position was that the mourning was a private matter. The British public, processing a grief in ways that no royal protocol had anticipated, saw the gates of Buckingham Palace closed, with no flag at half-mast, the spectacle of flowers accumulating at the railings, and the silence of an institution that did not understand that what was happening was not an ordinary period of mourning. The Sun published a front page that read simply, "Where is our Queen? Where is her flag?" The public pressure was of such magnitude that Elizabeth II had to appear on television the day before the funeral to deliver a speech in which she described Diana as an exceptional and unique human being. Earl Spencer delivered a eulogy that included the line that Diana would have been overwhelmed by the public's affection but confused by the superstar status some wanted to impose on her, when what she was a very special person. And he included, more veiled, but not invisible, the accusation directed at the royal family that those with blood on their hands should reflect. The royal family present in the Abbey listened in silence. Elton John sang Candle in the Wind with lyrics rewritten for Diana. The recording became the best-selling single in the history of popular music, 33 million copies. The royalties were donated entirely to the Princess Diana Memorial Fund. In the days following the funeral, the Blair government advanced the privacy protection legislation that had been stalled for months. It was too late for Diana. It was the implicit acknowledgement that the system that had killed her needed to be regulated. Diana's legacy is not a settled matter. Her sons have built completely different trajectories. Prince William, today Prince of Wales and future King of England, has carried forward some of the causes his mother championed: mental health, work with homeless people. His wife, Princess Catherine, has adopted some of Diana's ways of connecting with people in difficult situations. Prince Harry, on the other hand, took a path that in many respects seems like the attempt of someone who witnessed too closely what the institution did to his mother, and who decided he preferred to lose his position rather than repeat the pattern. In his memoir, Spare, Harry described the summer of 1997 with the love of someone who remembers that summer was the last happy one. He was 12 years old when his mother died. What remains of Diana in the world in 2025 is something that no financial or political analysis can fully measure. The museums exhibiting her dresses generate lines that wrap around the block. The television productions about her life produce the highest audiences of their respective platforms. Her image on the Jonquil diving board, alone above the Mediterranean, remains one of the most recognized photographs of the 20th century. And the mystery of what her life would have been if the Mercedes had taken a different route, if the driver had not been drinking, if they had been wearing their seatbelts, remains one of the great counterfactual questions of modern history. Would she have continued with Dodi? The evidence from those who knew her well suggests probably not. Would she have returned to Hasnat Khan? He says no. Would she have found someone else? Probably. Would she have continued with the Mind campaign and the AIDS work and found new causes to turn into instruments of her global influence? Almost certainly. Would she have survived as a public figure in the era of social media, of the 24-hour news cycle, of the radical transparency the digital world imposes? That is the hardest question of all, and one no one can answer. What is clear is that Diana Spencer was the first figure of the British monarchy to understand that the contract between the royal institution and the public had changed permanently in the 20th century, and that adapting to that change required something the royal family had not produced until then: a person capable of connecting emotionally with millions of strangers as if she had known them all her life. She did it naturally, or in a way that seemed natural, which is almost the same thing, and she died in part because the world that had created that ability, the world of global media attention, had no mechanism for protecting the people who generated that kind of symbolic value from the mechanisms that exploited it. The Alma-Tunnel is the place where that failure of the system produced its most visible consequence. It was not the only place where that system was failing. It was simply the most watched. There is a final irony in the story of Mohamed Al Fayed and the accident that killed his son that deserves to be named. Mohamed spent the 26 years he lived after Dodi's death maintaining that the accident was a murder organized by the British royal family to prevent Diana from marrying an Egyptian Muslim. That theory was not only unsupported by any independent investigation, it was actively refuted by all of them. But the narrative served Al Fayed to achieve something money had never been able to buy him: permanent presence in the conversations about Diana's history, the association of his name and his family's with the most famous name in the British monarchy, and the role of victim of a conspiracy that the powers of the British establishment had mounted against him. It was the perfect accusation for someone who had never been accepted by that establishment. Accuse the establishment of having organized the crime that had damaged him most profoundly. No one could prove it was a lie in a way that would silence him, because the absence of evidence can always be reinterpreted as evidence of a cover-up. The tribunal that investigated the case in the United Kingdom determined in 2008 that Diana and Dodi had been the victims of grossly negligent manslaughter produced by the reckless driving of Henri Paul and the pursuit by the paparazzi. Not by state assassination, not by Prince Philip, not by the CIA, by a drunk driver who drove too fast through a tunnel that could not accommodate that speed, while two people who had known each other for 47 days and were still discovering what they were to each other rode in the back seat without seatbelts. That is what happened. It is a story that does not need a conspiracy to be tragic. It is already tragic without one. If this story has stayed with you, if at any point you found yourself thinking about what it means to be the most famous person in the world and not be able to get out of a car without someone photographing you, leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to know more about the secrets of the families the world has turned into icons, about what lies behind the perfect images, this channel has the stories of Stephanie of Monaco, the Romanov sisters, and Letizia Ortiz, the stories no one tells in full. Subscribe